What's going on, everybody? It's Royj coming at you with a brand new video, and today I'm very excited to bring to y'all a Dinomorphia deck profile post Cyberstorm access. This deck has always been something that I've really enjoyed. I played it during Difo format when Rexstorm came out in Frenzy, and I actually saw a lot of success with it, despite cards like Super Poly and Vishuda running around in order to out it. It sort of fell off a little bit because decks like Tyr were just so overwhelmingly dominant, but now with Cyberstorm access, the deck has gotten access to a brand new archetypal trap card and an indirect trap deck support card, both of which make the deck significantly better and strengthen some of the weaknesses that it has. This is a deck profile though, and not a monologue, so I don't want to waste any more time. Let's go ahead and get right into my Dinomorphia deck profile for the May 2023 format, post Cyberstorm access. Starting us off with the monsters, we have, of course, 3 copies of Dinomorphia Theritzia, and 3 copies of Dinomorphia Diplos. Back when I was playing Extrav like some peasant, I was playing 2 Diplos to my memory because I didn't want to draw it off of the Extrav, and I just didn't want to draw it, period. But you really need to max out on both monsters considering they only have 2 and almost all of your fusion traps you want to fuse from deck with. And with Prosperity, you don't really have to worry about blind drawing into it off of the effect and banishing all your resources from your extra deck, and so it's a lot less of a risk to play 3, though it is still pretty annoying when you draw it, but it's not the end of the world, though I do wish that on top of the new trap card they also got a new main deck monster, but I mean, you can't really get everything you want now, can you? But you already know this, like everyone knows about like, oh, you need to play like max copies of the Dinomorphias because, you know, stuff. So let's get into something a bit more interesting, that being 2 copies of Wannabe. So Wannabe is a brand new powerhouse card for trap decks out of Cyberstorm access. It is a level 2 light insect with 0 attack and defense and the following effect. During the end phase, you can send it from your hand or face-up field to the graveyard, and if you do, excavate cards from the top of your deck up to the number of your opponent's unused spell and trap zones, and then set 1 trap among those cards to your side of the field, but send it to the graveyard during the next end phase, and then place the rest on the bottom in any order. You can only use this effect of Wannabe once per turn. This card is revolutionary for any trap deck, but especially Dinomorphia. So Dinomorphia, of course, lives and dies by having access to its fusion traps like Frenzy and Domain, and so being able to have an extra copy of Prosperity, essentially, that avoids Ash and Droll, just to access your fusion traps, or any trap really, because it doesn't even say normal trap, is absolutely massive. Not to mention, keep in mind it says during the end phase, not your end phase, and so if your opponent like sets up no monster negates or something like that, maybe you hand trap them enough to where it stops them, or in case they just don't really play any in the deck, then you can either bait out something or use this during the end phase to grab something like your Domain. You can grab something like a Gozen match in order to break apart their board. You can even grab Evenly Matched. And that's not even the full extent of this card's uses. One of my commenters actually informed me about considering Chaos Angel doesn't require tuners, you can literally normal summon a Wannabe and then use it and a Rexstorm to go into Chaos Angel. I think that's just so funny. I cannot praise Wannabe enough for being so amazing for almost any trap deck around. I think this card is a absolute staple mandatory for decks like Eldritch, Labyrinth, Dinomorphia, all sorts of decks like that, and I'm really, really glad to be playing it. And that's actually it for the regular monsters in the deck. I mean, hey, before it was just the 3 of each Dinomorphia, at least we have Wannabe now. On to the hand traps. So this is a bit format dependent, but we're playing 3 copies of Droll and Lockbird, 3 copies of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, and 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence. So these are overall pretty staple hand traps for the current format, Droll stopping things like Super Heavy and also being good against things like Purely, Castor, etc. Ash being Ash, Imperm being Imperm, there's not too much to say. I was playing Ogre over the Drolls until I realized that Ogre isn't the best thing against Super Heavy compared to Droll, because you can absolutely eat a Gamma to the face if you try to Ogre Wakaushi, and Ogering the Big Benkei is a good idea in theory because it does stop them from Pendulum summoning later, but they could probably already have a good soul card in hand and at least make a small board, whereas Droll completely stops them from making anything but basically Baguska. Completely up to you and up to the format though, or if you're following this list like after this format, which I mean like, it's gonna be a while from now, but hey, how's it going? But otherwise, yeah, these are the hand traps that I'm content on in the main. The only spell cards I'm playing in the deck, or at least in the main, are 2 copies of Prosperity and 1 copy of Called By. I had 3 copies of Prosperity, but one of them was being borrowed from Javon, and now he needs it back from Adolce. So I'm just playing the 2 right now. If I had the 3rd, I'd absolutely play it. And then Called By is Called By. I mean, it stops any hand trap, especially Ash, which is really annoying for the deck. I was also playing Crossout, but I essentially replaced those with the fact that we got the new trap card because it functions as both Crossout and Solemn Strike. I also replaced Solemn Strike with some other things, but I think these are fine as the only spells to play. Now, of course, onto the juicy part of the deck, we have the traps, starting us off with 3 copies of Frenzy and 3 copies of Domain. Very, very standard here. I mean, these are like the mandatory cards that you need to have in order to play your deck. Accessing Rexterm is like the biggest thing you can do in this deck, and these are just so accessible now, especially with Wannabe. So I've been ranting this entire video about the new Dinomorphia trap card, and you probably already know what it does if you come to this deck profile, but just in case, I'm going to explain the effects of 2 copies of Dinomorphia Intact. So Dinomorphia Intact is a counter trap card that says when a monster effect is activated, while you control a Dinomorphia card, keep in mind it says card, not monster, pay half your life points, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that monster. Also, whenever you take battle damage this turn, the damage taken becomes half your life points at that time. During damage calculation, while your life points are 2,000 or less, if you would take battle damage, you can banish this card from your graveyard and you take no battle damage from that battle. You can only activate 1 Intact per turn. This card is amazing for Dinomorphia. Keep in mind, the biggest threat to Dinomorphia was cards like Ash. You have to max out on things like Called By. I mean, maxing out is like the 1 copy, but still, you'd have to max out on that, and then things like Solemn Strike, which you can't even use late game because you won't have the life points for it unless you summon Stealth Bergia. And so having a searchable out to Ash now in Archetype is really nice. Not to mention that it does way more than that, because you can also stop any other monster effect, but also keep in mind it just prevents you from dying at all to battle damage that entire turn. And because it's a counter trap, there's almost nothing your opponent can do about it, and on the follow-up turns, you still have that battle damage reduction to 0 that isn't a hard once per turn while it's in the graveyard. It's just so much easier to play through disruptions like Ash, and then also the survivability of the deck has jumped up significantly, where you don't have to keep dumping copies of Sonic to the grave and like praying your opponent won't attack your Diplos. I really like this card. It might not be a 3rd main deck monster, but it's still really solid for the deck, and I think 2 is a good amount to play because it's just so flexible at outing almost anything. For the rest of the Dinomorphia trap cards, we have 1 copy of Dinomorphia Sonic, 1 copy of Dinomorphia Brute, and 1 copy of Dinomorphia Alert. All of these cards are either really good or perfectly fine, Sonic being a extra copy of Solemn Judgment essentially for spell and trap negates. Pretty solid, especially because it triggers the floating of your Dinomorphias, and it's also really good because it gets that Dinomorphia off the board like a Diplos or a Theritzia, in which case maybe you'd otherwise end up dying because it's on the field. Dinomorphia Brute serves as one of your only like archetypal disruptions that isn't your Rexterm, so this card is really crucial. And then Dinomorphia Alert is probably the most important of all, because this revives your Rexterm in case you otherwise would have died by not having your Rexterm, getting outed by something like Kaijus, for example. And it's also really good in case your opponent doesn't out your Rexterm. You can just use this during the end phase, summon back your Diplos and Theritzia for an additional basically 3k damage on board with just them, getting both of their effects to burn for 500 and go up to the 2k with Theritzia, and the next turn you're able to attack with them, go into a rank 4 with them, etc. etc. I used to play each of these at 2 copies, but the main problem with this is that you have to have a Dinomorphia monster. Like, so many times I just ended up losing, just by having too many copies of these in hand and no Dinomorphia monster because I didn't open Theritzia, Diplos, or a Fusion Trap. Another reason why having a 3rd main deck monster would be good. For the non-Dinomorphia traps, we're of course playing 3 copies of Solemn Judgment. This deck is basically just Solemn Judgment the deck. You're paying half your life points for everything anyways, and Judgment's just really good for stopping things like Evenly, Harpy's Feather Duster, etc. But it's also really good at stopping your opponent's playmakers, like normal summoning a monster that would otherwise like search them a card. So an interesting choice that I've decided is maining 3 copies of Gozen Match. So this card was delegated to the side for the longest time, until I ran into 4 people playing Kaijus in a row at my locals. Now again, this is a little bit local centric, but keep in mind that now, this is before Cyberstorm Access by the way, this was like 2 weeks ago. This is before that, but now a lot of people are playing cards like Santa Claus in the main to out things like the Ex Purely Noir, as well as, you know, tributing over things like Ibli, etc, etc. And so Gozen Match can end up saving you from getting Kaiju, Santa Claus, whatever, but it's also just really good against a lot of the decks right now. I mean, you hit Purely, they can only go for either Purely or Lily, because, you know, lights and darks, and they can't really access much of their extra deck outside of the Noir, Happiness, and the other Happiness. Super Baby Samurai is mostly Earth, but they're gonna have to commit to Sarutobi in order to pop this in case they really want to get access to their other place in the extra, like Baron. And then don't even get me started on Castra, where they have to start with a Fenrir in order to actually out this card at all. Not to mention just the sheer amount of rogue decks that this card hits. It's just really good overall, and it's actually settable off of Wannabe, so yeah, while it only lasts for one turn, it could end up being enough for you to get the OTK and prevent your opponent from killing you. I'd absolutely recommend at least putting this in the side if you don't want to main it, because this card is just so good right now. We also have 2 copies of Ferret Flames, the absolute GOAT of the main deck. This card has single-handedly won so many games, like outing almost all of your opponent's monsters, if not all of their monsters, because you have like 2 life points left. Absolutely crazy. A lot of people don't understand that this outs towers as well, so this is a really good out to things like the Noir in case you end up going first, sorry. And it's just so hilarious, the 2 Dino players I played in a row both having to understand that the card like works around Misk. Really funny there as well. Honestly, the only thing keeping me from playing 3 of this is just bricking, but it's also super searchable off things like Prosperity or Wannabe, so you don't really have to worry about playing 2 anyway. I really like this card though. And then finally, to wrap up the main deck, we have 3 copies of Evenly Matched. You are playing a trap deck, and you're playing a deck that wants normal traps in your grave, or just traps in your grave in general for your Dinomorphias to banish. But also, you know, if you're forced to go second, you really want to get this off of something like Wannabe on their turn, or Prosperity on your turn. Really easy to dig for in that regard, which is really nice, because it's basically like your only way of going second that isn't setting a bunch of cards, including Gozen and passing. That does it for the main deck. On to the extra deck, we have 3 copies of Dinomorphia Rexsturm, 3 copies of Dinomorphia Kentrigina, and 3 copies of Dinomorphia Stealthburgia. I'm just maxing out on all of them because I'm playing Prosperity, including Stealthburgia, because I actually like having that extra Stealthburgia, because I usually banish one off Prosperity, or if I don't, I use both off of Frenzy, and then I keep the third in case I want to actually go into it, because this card is really good at applying pressure. Like, you can deal a bunch of damage, especially against a deck like Castra, where all their monsters are really big, and then just have this on board and pressure your opponent out of using effects. It's similar to Masquerade in that sense. Speaking of Masquerade, I still stand by the ruling that this card works against Masquerade, fight me. But yeah, not much to say here. You want to max out on all of them anyway because of cards like Prosperity, and just you want to have all your resources in general for Frenzy, so I'm not going to really elaborate very much. We're also playing 1 copy of Dolka and 1 copy of Logia. These cards are huge in this deck, especially on turn 3. Like, you go first, you set up your Rexsturm plays, especially with like Alert or whatever, like I mentioned, and then on your turn 3, in case you can't OTK, which is actually pretty common if you open Domain instead of Frenzy, because you won't have that Kentrigina on board, you can use your Theritzia and your Diplos to go into Dolka or Logia in order to prevent your opponent from activating a power card that would otherwise help save them, especially things like Dolka outing things like Vishuda or Druisworm, which is a really big problem I ran into. I was playing against Thunder Dragon Link, and I lost to it because he opened Druisworm twice in a row, so that was fun. And then Logia, of course, hitting random things that would like be like an Imperm maybe, or anything else that would out the Rexsturm. Onto the links, 1 copy of Donner. This was kind of like a random pick I threw in here. I had 2 flex spots that I was looking for because I don't own Psychic and Punisher or Chaos Angel, unfortunately. I'm not dropping that kind of dough on those cards. Maybe Punisher, I don't know. But this card is actually not that bad in case you have like a hand trap or Wannabe along with a Dinomorphia. Just normal summon one of them and then link off into Donner. This can out some maybe problematic monsters that you otherwise couldn't beat over. I don't know exactly what it would be, but it is an option to have. I'm also playing 1 copy of Dark the Dark Charmer Gloomy in order to combo with our Nightmare Unicorn. I was also playing Access Code in the initial iteration of this deck, but I don't think Access Code's too necessary and it doesn't come up too much, but I might consider it in case we see a lot of Dark Link 2s in the format. But it's mostly just using Dark to access Unicorn because, I mean, it's a free shuffle. But Dark can also help you access Underworld Goddess, which is another one of the flex spots that I had. So again, things like Noir running around in any other Towers monster could end up being a bit annoying, and while it's not like the most common, you can actually set up a good amount of monsters on board to go into the Underworld Goddess. In particular, if you have 3 monsters on board, you can turn 2 of them into a Dark, and then use Dark to revive one of your opponent's monsters, and then use it as a link too, and then your 2 monsters and one of your opponents in order to go into an Underworld Goddess, which could end up being pretty easy. Again, I'd probably play End Punisher or even Chaos Angel in this slot if you can afford it or already have it. Otherwise, this is what I'm currently rocking with. Well, everybody, that's going to do it for my Dinomorphia deck profile post Cyberstorm access. I hope you all did enjoy. I've been having a lot of fun with this deck after I picked it up again. I literally just looked at a random deck in my binder and I was like, you know what? I'm going to play this instead of playing something like Bird Up for a change, and it was actually a lot of fun. I forgot how cool this deck was to play. I've had some of my sweatiest games with this deck ever, but I've also had some of my freest games ever, which is kind of unfortunate. It's kind of like a mixed bag depending on the matchup and the skill of the other player. I think that even though it is technically Floodgate Turbo with Rexstorm, there are a lot of other plays the deck can do without it, especially in the grind game. But I don't know, if that's just my opinion, let me know yours down in the comments below, because that's going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as I'll split this video and the channel into recommended. And if you like this content and you want to see more like it, like the rest of my deck profiles, I should have 1 or 2 more coming in for the rest of the month. Then perhaps consider subscribing, because I'm going to 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. Not to mention it supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.